The next part of cognition is our thinking and our problem solving. So we've moved from memory to now thinking, okay? Thinking, we also refer to as cognition, okay? This is the process that involves knowing, understanding, processing, remembering, communicating. It's basically involving every other higher cognitive process that we do, okay? We organize our thinking into a number of different categories, okay? We like organization. Our brain likes organization, okay? So we break our thinking down into 3 different categories. The first category are concepts. Concepts are our mental groups of familiar, similar objects, events, or ideas, okay? Concepts are broad. They're large, okay? We tend to group things together. For example, there are a variety of chairs, but there are also common features that define the concept of a chair, okay? This is a concept. We have a concept of a chair. Further down from that, then, a smaller section then would be a schema. A schema is the list of features that go along with the concepts, okay? So the characteristics that make a chair a chair. For example, it has a seat, it has a back, it has some legs or a base. That makes something a chair. So it's the characteristics. So the concept is the overarching category. The schema are the characteristics. And then finally, we have our prototype. Our prototype is the typical or best example of a concept that demonstrates the schema. Okay, so it is when you close your eyes and someone mentions chair, it is what comes to mind when that person mentions it. Okay, it is the very first thing that comes to mind. It follows those characteristics. So let's try to with another concept. Okay, so we're going to have the concept of police officer. What are the characteristics that fit a police officer? Our concept is police officer. Our schema would then be the characteristics. So what characteristics? Maybe they have a badge. Maybe they have a hat on. They're wearing a uniform. Maybe think like what gender would that person be? Maybe you think male. How physically fit would that person be? Do they have facial hair? Like all of those things are characteristics that you would come up with for a schema. And then your prototype is going to be your best example or mental representation. It would be what you would draw if you were to have to draw a police officer. Okay? So, does this match your prototype? Probably not. This is a big deal. Sometimes these concepts, these schema, these prototypes can hinder our problem solving. Our brain likes to make shortcuts. Okay? It likes to categorize things, but sometimes we make judgments about others or situations that aren't true because of these categories that our brain makes. And we're going to talk about that. So, what is problem solving? Well, we solve problems in 3 different ways, okay? Obviously, problem solving is how we make sense of the world or new things, new information that comes to us. The first way that we problem solve is through an algorithm. An algorithm is a logical rule or procedure that guarantees solving a particular problem. Okay, so algorithms exhaust all possibilities before arriving at a solution. These take a long time. Computers use algorithms because they have time and they can do it quickly. Trial and error is an algorithm because you're trying every single possibility until you get to the right answer. So let's use an idea of trying to find oatmeal at the grocery store. If you're trying to find oatmeal at the grocery store and you wanted to use an algorithm, you're going to go down every single aisle in a logical way, right? So down and back those aisles until you would find oatmeal. That's an algorithm. It's slow. It takes a long time. It's not the best way to do things. That's why we have heuristics. Heuristics are simple thinking strategies that allow us to make judgments and solve problems efficiently. So these are shortcuts that our brain takes. We all do these, okay? These enhance the likelihood of success sooner. However, they do not assure that we are successful. It's speedier, but it's more error prone, okay? So it doesn't quite take as much time, but sometimes we're going to have an error. So if we're finding the oatmeal, the heuristic we might use is reading the signs on the top of the aisles and determining, oh, cereal, I bet oatmeal's in there. Okay, that's a heuristic. And then finally, I'm sorry, we're going to use heuristics first. So there's two kinds of heuristics that we can identify, and that is the representative and availability heuristic. And these often help us solve problems, but they can also bias our judgment. And you'll see why in just a second. So the first is the representativeness heuristic. Okay, so this is judging the likelihood of something or an object in terms of how well they seem to represent or match a particular prototype. It allows us to make quick judgments. Okay, so we determine whether or not whatever we're seeing, that thing or that object, is representative of our prototype. So our example is, if you were to meet a man on the street, he's dressed in slacks and a sweater, he's small in stature, he wears glasses, he's soft-spoken, he's pretty shy. If you were to be asked if that man was a librarian or a construction worker, what would you say? Most of us wouldn't say that he's a construction worker, right? Because he more closely represents our prototype of a librarian, okay? That's the representativeness heuristic. The availability heuristic is the cognitive shortcut in which the probability of an event is determined by how easily the event can be brought to mind. We choose whether or not an event or a thing or an object is feasible based on what comes to our mind more available, right? So, for example, you're more likely to be afraid of flying and dying in a plane crash than you are to be scared of riding in a car and getting in a car crash. Despite the statistics that you're more likely to get into a car crash than in a plane accident, you see plane crashes much more publicly on the news. They are much more readily available in your mind than car crashes. Okay, that's the idea of the availability heuristic. And then our final problem-solving way that we use is insight. Insight is that aha moment, that sudden, novel realization of a solution to a problem. We've talked about insight learning, the idea of taking our past experiences and initial trial and error in order to gain insight, right? To gain information. Putting two things together in order to make a new way to solve something. Remember, this was the ape with the bananas and using a stick and the boxes. We have information that shows us that when this aha moment strikes, our right temporal cortex is activated. And it is the amount of time that we take between not knowing the solution and knowing it is about 0.3 seconds, meaning that aha moment, that insight moment, happens very rapidly once it is activated. Okay, so what are some obstacles to problem solving? Sometimes our ways of thinking, our shortcuts that our brain takes, get in the way of solving problems. Okay, and the first is fixation. Fixation is the inability to see a problem from a fresh perspective, right? So this is that problem that sometimes you just need a fresh set of eyes to look at something in order to determine whether or not it's right. There are two types of fixation. The first is a mental set. A mental set is the tendency for our old ways of problem solving to stay around, and we make it impossible for us to see the problem in new ways. Okay, so if you have always solved a problem a certain way, you are no longer going to be able to see new ways of solving that problem. You're always going to go to that. So for example, if you have always solved the problem of, getting bug bites by putting on bug spray, it is very unlikely that you're going to be able to see another solution to not getting bit by bugs. Functional fixedness, and then is our other type of fixation, and this is the tendency to think of familiar and typical functions or objects, or for objects. So, for example, if you have a spatula, you're really only going to be able to see that as a spatula to be able to flip food, rather than seeing it maybe as a fly swatter. Okay, so we tend to think of familiar objects only within their typical functions. Some other obstacles to problem solving is bias. Okay, so we've talked about confirmation bias in the past, but we're going to talk about it now in our own problem solving rather than just in research. So confirmation bias is the tendency to search for information that confirms a personal bias. So if you have a particular belief, you are going to look for the ideas that help your belief rather than hurt it. We seek evidence to support rather than evidence to dismiss our ideas. Sometimes we do this consciously, other times it's subconsciously. So sometimes our brain just allows us to do it, okay? So if you have a particular stereotype in your brain, let's say about a cheerleader, your brain might automatically search out examples that fit that stereotype, okay? That's confirmation bias. So, for example, you believe your boyfriend is faithful. So rather than notice that he is often receiving text message from other girls and isn't available for dates as he once was, you pay attention to the fact that he calls you once a day, even if it's only for a few moments, and always brings you flowers when he is able to take you out on a date. So you focus on those ideas, those pieces of evidence that support the idea that your boyfriend is faithful. You dismiss the evidence that could be he is not faithful. Another example of bias is belief bias. Belief bias is the tendency for one's pre-existing beliefs to distort our logical reasoning, sometimes by making invalid conclusions. So if you believe, based on your experience when you were sick as a child, that Vicks has healing qualities to your stuffy nose, then when you observe someone else's use of the rub, say in research, you are likely to interpret the data in favor of its healing powers. Okay, so this idea, like if you've always believed that Vicks is your lifesaver, you're going to interpret when someone else uses it that, oh, the Vicks is what helped you. Okay, that's belief bias. If you believe in a certain way of taking notes, for example, Cornell notes is the best way to learn, you may discount or turn away someone else's knowledge when they haven't taken notes the same way as you have, okay? Or you might say that their learning isn't as solid as yours because they didn't take notes your way. And then finally, we have belief perseverance. Belief perseverance is our tendency to cling to our beliefs even if we are given contrary evidence. So body image. If your friend believes she's fat, no matter how much weight she loses or how many dress sizes she's down or how many times you tell her that she's not fat, she still sees herself as fat. That's belief perseverance. Another one, if you believe you are the greatest friend in the world, but no matter how many friends you lose because you're arrogant or because you lack compassion, you still believe that you are a rock solid friend, okay? That's belief perseverance. So how are these different? Well, confirmation bias, you're seeking evidence and you only see evidence that supports your bias. Belief bias, your belief alters the way you make conclusions, either accepting illogical conclusions because it matches or rejecting logical conclusions because it contradicts. And then belief perseverance, contradicting evidence is obvious, and even if you acknowledge it, you still stick to your original belief.